In the forgotten folds of Asia's countryside, where mist clings to the mountains like breath to a mirror, old rituals never die. They sleep, they wait, they whisper through the cracks of wooden doors and drift beneath the rice fields, heavy with secrets and soaked in ancestral blood. Welcome to Folk Fear, where every tale is rooted in real rural legends, ancient rites, and ghost stories no one dares repeat aloud. Tonight, we unseal one such tale, hidden in the shadows of southern Yunnan, where a cursed lantern burns with bone and betrayal, and a dead groom waits for a bride who never said yes. This is not just a ghost story. It's a warning, a ritual, a marriage of the living and the long, long dead. You are now entering the story of the Widow's Bone Lantern.
The train screeched through mist and mountains, carving its way across the southern edge of Yunnan. Beyond the cracked window, Minwen watched the forests rise like waves of green ghosts, ancient and endless. The fog pressed against the glass, thick and soupy, like breath from something unseen. She hadn't been back to Junlu village in 17 years, not since her mother pulled her away in the dead of night, whispering prayers with trembling lips and never looking back. Now, her grandmother was dead. The official call had been vague, heart failure, they said. No investigation, no ceremony, just a name and a box of ashes. But then came the letter, a yellowed envelope with Minwen's name written in her grandmother's hand, sealed with a thumbprint in dried crimson. Inside, a key, a piece of paper, and one sentence written in crooked brush strokes. The lantern still burns. You must come before your 27th winter. Wen turned 27 in 3 days. The train groaned to a halt at a small rural station. The platform was empty, save for a dog sleeping in the corner and a lantern swaying in the fog. She stepped out with a suitcase and the weight of something she didn't yet understand. The air smelled like damp earth and faint incense, half memory, half omen. The road to Junyu was dirt and silence. No cars, no buses, just the creak of cicadas and the rustle of leaves whispering in dialects she no longer spoke. A farmer she didn't recognize pulled up beside her in an ox cart. He never asked her name, never made eye contact, just gestured to climb aboard. They didn't speak the whole way. He dropped her off at the base of the hill and turned back without a word. Junyu village hadn't changed. Time moved differently here. The same crooked wooden houses, the same moss-covered tiles, the same ancestral shrine at the hill's peak, its red gates faded with time and sun. But something was off. Doors were shut, windows covered. Even the chickens walked quietly. They had seen her, and they remembered. Wen reached the house near dusk, her grandmother's house. Slanted roof, red paper charm still pasted on the door, cracked and curling. A rusted wind chime clinked once and then fell silent, as if warning her not to enter. She did anyway. The inside was exactly as she remembered, and entirely wrong. The rooms were dim despite the windows. Dust hung in the air like spirits without homes. On the walls were portraits of ancestors with scratched-out eyes. A red altar stood against the far wall, covered in ashes and dried candle wax. And at the center of the room, the ancestral shrine, the lantern. It wasn't lit, but it glowed, a dull pulsing light like breath behind bone. The lantern was old, carved from what looked like ivory, but it was no ivory she had ever seen. The patterns were Taoist glyphs, banishment seals, soul bindings, wedding marks. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Never touch what burns without flame. Never speak when the drums are silent. Never stay past your name day. Wen stepped closer. The lantern's glow throbbed. Her reflection in its glass wasn't quite right. Her face moved a moment too late. She backed away. That night, she didn't sleep. The floorboards creaked even when she lay still. The wind outside sounded like chanting. And once, just once, she swore she heard wedding bells in the distance. Morning was no kinder. The villagers avoided her. Old women turned their backs. Children were pulled away by their mothers. At the small market, no one would sell to her. One man muttered under his breath, "She came back to wake the dead." By noon, she stood alone before the village elder's house. The door opened before she knocked. He was thin and brittle, like the house he sat in. His eyes were milky but sharp. "You should not have returned, Miss Win Lee." "You know who I am?" He nodded. "I remember when you were born, and I remember the night your mother fled. We all heard the drums stop. That's how we knew your grandmother had defied the lantern." Wen sat down. "What is the lantern?" He looked away. "A bride's light, an offering flame, a bond between the living and the dead. Your grandmother was the last chosen vessel, but she gave it away, to you. I never agreed to anything. You were born into it. You don't get to choose." Wen's voice trembled. "Choose what?" He sighed, and from his robe he pulled a torn scroll. On it, a ritual circle drawn in blood and ash. "A wedding," he whispered, "a ghost marriage, to a groom who never died, not properly." That night, Win returned to the house, the scroll clenched in her fist. She unlocked the old chest beneath the altar. Dust billowed out like smoke. Inside, Taoist robes, a red veil, a box of burnt hair and dried nails, and a second letter. It was addressed to her in her grandmother's hand. "Winner, forgive me. I tried to pass it on. I tried to protect you. But the lantern chooses blood. You are of the line. You are the bride. Do not relight it. Do not wear the veil. Do not feed the lantern ash. If you do, he will come." The lantern pulsed once, brighter, and in the glass her reflection smiled. But she didn't. The second night in Junliu was worse. Li Wen had meant to leave. The villagers' coldness, the smell of old paper and mold, the way the wind outside moaned like a flute in mourning, it was enough to turn any city girl around. But something tethered her. It wasn't logic. It wasn't guilt. It was something pulling. When she tried to pack, her suitcase zipper split in her hands. When she tried to book a car, her phone flickered and died, though it had been at 80% just minutes earlier. And when she opened the front door, ready to walk out, she found the entire village blanketed in fog. Not morning fog, not mist, something heavier, like ash. She shut the door, and the lantern pulsed again. That night, the dreams returned. She was standing in a courtyard lined with red lanterns, each swaying gently, though there was no wind. A voice called her name, not loudly, but intimately, familiar. The syllables curled at the edge of her ear like someone breathing behind her. She turned, and the world blurred. Now she was in a bridal chamber, dark, damp, covered in dust. A red veil hung over her head, and her hands clutched a scroll sealed in blood. A groom sat across from her, motionless, wrapped in funeral robes. His face was a blank wooden mask. The drums began, slow, funereal, deep enough to shake her chest. And then she awoke, gasping, drenched in sweat. At the foot of her bed, the bone lantern glowed faintly, and in the silence, she heard breathing, but not her own. In the morning, she forced herself to act. No more ghost stories, no more village superstition. She was a rational woman, an anthropologist, for God's sake. All of this could be explained by grief, exhaustion, and the suggestive power of an old, decaying house. Still, something gnawed at her. The lantern. It hadn't moved, but the light it cast seemed different each time she looked at it. Sometimes it pulsed, other times it was still. She reached for it, curiosity louder than caution. Cold. It was deathly cold to the touch, and the surface, it wasn't wood or ivory. It was porous, textured, like bone. Her heart thudded. She set it down too fast, and it rocked gently, then stopped. She noticed a seam running vertically along the wall behind the altar. A door. Not a modern door, but a wooden panel, its edges barely visible, sealed with wax and lined with red string talismans. There was something behind it. Wen's fingers traced the seam, and she hesitated, but only for a moment. Then she peeled the talismans away. The wax crumbled, and with a push, the hidden panel swung open, groaning like an old throat clearing itself. The air inside was still, too still, as if whatever lay beyond had not been touched by breath in decades. It was a narrow hallway, no more than 5 feet deep. Cobwebs clung to her face as she ducked inside. The walls were lined with faded charcoal drawings, circles, sigils, the character for death, over and over again. At the end of the hall, she found a small chamber, windowless. An altar sat at the center, not unlike the one in the main room, but darker, more ornate, decorated with dried flowers, burned incense, and a bowl full of what looked like powdered bone. And resting on the altar, a second lantern. No, not a second. The real one. The outside one was just a shell, a decoy. This one burned without flame. Inside it, a wisp of smoke curled endlessly in its glass belly, forming shapes that dissolved the moment they appeared. Wen leaned closer. A face. For a moment, a face stared back. Wide eyes, stitched lips, and a forehead branded with Taoist ink. She fell back, her breath ripped from her lungs. The air had changed. Behind her, something moved. A whisper, a rustle. She turned. Nothing. But as she looked back at the lantern, the face was gone, and in its place, her own. Except the mouth was smiling. Wen stumbled out of the room, clutching her chest, lungs on fire. The air outside was no better, cloying, damp, charged. She shut the hidden door and pressed her back against it, heart pounding. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. She needed answers. She dug through the old chests in the main room, pushing aside dried herbs, cracked bowls, and yellowed scrolls. At the very bottom, she found a bundle wrapped in silk, an old wedding robe. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside were 3 items: a blood-stained red veil, a Taoist scroll sealed with bone powder, and a letter addressed to the next bride. Her hands shook as she opened it. If you are reading this, it is because the lantern has chosen you. Do not believe you are free. The ritual has already begun. Your grandmother tried to stop it, but she only delayed what was always meant to be. Every daughter of our line is promised to him, the one who was buried alive, the one who waits in the flame. There is no running, only choosing. Complete the marriage or be consumed by it. Her blood ran cold. Was this why her grandmother never spoke of her past? Was this why her mother fled? She reread the final line, her eyes stinging. Do not light the lantern again unless you are ready to meet your husband. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat before the altar, the wedding robe in her lap, the letter beside her, and the lantern between them. It pulsed, a slow heartbeat, not a flicker of fire, but breath, life. Wen stared into it. A shadow moved behind the glass. She reached forward, hand trembling, and touched the side. For one moment, the house fell silent, utterly still. Then came the knock. Not on the walls, not on the door, but from inside the hidden room. 3 knocks, slow, measured, as though from a fist no longer flesh. Wen backed away. The lantern's glow brightened. A faint crack appeared in its glass. The inked sigils on its surface shimmered faintly, like something trying to escape. Suddenly, the entire altar groaned. The lantern rocked, and from the shadows behind her, she heard the sound of silk dragging along the floor, like a bride walking without feet. She turned. No one. But when she looked back, the veil was gone from her lap and draped over the lantern, like an offering, like a promise. She did not remember falling asleep, but she woke the next morning with ash on her fingers and the wedding robe wrapped around her head like a crown. She tried to throw it away. It clung to her hand. She burned it in the stove. It reappeared on the altar. She buried it in the woods. By sundown, it was hanging from her bedroom door. That night, the dreams deepened. The groom was closer, his face clearer, and his mouth was no longer stitched shut. The third morning in Junliu dawned gray and silent, the sky sagging with unspoken things. Wen hadn't slept, not truly. Her dreams had become warped windows, mirrors that didn't reflect, doors that opened both ways. In the dream, she'd worn the red veil again, but this time, the groom had touched her hand. She could still feel the coldness. It wasn't death, it was older. She spent the morning trying to rationalize, to catalog what she was seeing as an anthropologist would. Ghost marriages existed in historical context. She had studied them, rituals where families arranged weddings between the living and the dead to complete interrupted lifespans, appease restless spirits, or preserve bloodlines. But those were ceremonial, symbolic. They didn't involve dreams that bled into reality. They didn't involve bone lanterns that glowed without fuel. They didn't leave veil-shaped bruises across her neck. Her fingers trembled as she unrolled the Taoist scroll found in the wedding chest. It was older than anything she had ever handled. The parchment crackled like dry skin. Characters were written in a mixture of red and black ink, some faded, some freshly dark, as though they had rewritten themselves in the night. At the top, painted in thick red brushstrokes, were 4 characters. Jia Huan Suo Ming, to marry the soul, to bind the life. Below it, line after line of ritual instruction, Taoist invocation marks, binding circles, offerings of ash, hair, and breath. And then, the vows. They weren't metaphorical. They were binding contracts, signed in blood, stained with bone dust, enforced by the dead. She flipped through the scrolls in the altar drawer, Dozens of them, some barely legible, others full of detailed diagrams of funeral beds, ghost wedding altars, paper brides and grooms, and intricate seals meant to keep spirits from wandering too far once summoned. But one scroll was different. It wasn't written in Mandarin or dialect. It was written in glyphs, untranslatable, organic, carved almost, instead of painted, etched into the parchment with what looked like fingernail. The symbols twisted when she looked at them too long, shifted. Her eyes watered. Her nose bled. She turned away. Later that day, she walked into the village shrine, not the family one, but the public altar built beneath a gnarled banyan tree, older than anyone alive. She found the monk sweeping the steps, or at least he once had been a monk. He wore a faded robe, hair long and gray, and one eye milk-blind. His movements were slow, deliberate. When he saw her, he stopped. "You've come back," he said, not with welcome, but weariness. "You know who I am?" He didn't answer. Instead, he nodded toward the shrine's rear chamber. The dead know. The house remembers. Wen stepped forward, scroll in hand. "What is this? What is the widow's lantern?" He looked at the scroll. His face darkened. "That is not a name you should speak aloud." "I already have." "Then it's already listening." Wen's voice cracked. "What is it?" He hesitated, and then said, "Long ago, there was a man in Junliu, brilliant, feared, born under an unclean star. He studied forbidden Taoist arts, learned to call souls back from the grave. He said he could create eternal unions between the living and the dead. He proposed to bind himself to a bloodline. To live forever? To wait forever." The monk stepped closer. They buried him alive, sealed him inside a coffin painted with wedding talismans, locked with nails dipped in ox blood and salt. They thought that would stop him, but the coffin cracked. "And the lantern?" He glanced behind him, as if the wind would carry the words to the wrong ears. "It was made from his rib, carved by his bride. She performed the rites, lit the flame. She thought she could control him, but it was he who lived inside her, and when she bore daughters, the curse passed through them." Wen's voice became a whisper. "So I'm next." "You were always next, the moment you were born, the moment your grandmother gave away the veil." "Can I stop it?" He paused. "You can delay it, you can bargain, but you cannot sever what was bound in bone. You can only pass it to another girl." He looked away, and Wen understood. Back at the house, she tore through her grandmother's shelves, books, ledgers, inked family trees. She pieced together the truth like shattered porcelain. Her grandmother had a sister, a twin, born just minutes after her. But only one name was ever spoken. The other vanished from every record. No death certificate, no photograph, just a note in the margin of an old prayer book. "Shen yu deng huo," offered to the flame. Her grandmother hadn't broken the ritual. She'd redirected it, sacrificed her own blood to delay her fate. And now, the price had come due. She lit incense, not out of belief, but out of fear, out of respect. The smoke curled up in slow spirals. She sat cross-legged before the lantern, scroll open on her lap, eyes stinging from exhaustion. Then she did the one thing she swore she wouldn't. She read the vows aloud. Not all of them, just the first line. "I bind my breath to yours, my days to your shadow." The flame inside the lantern brightened, the shadows in the room deepened, and in the silence that followed, Wen heard the drums again, distant, muffled, like footsteps of something marching toward her through time. She closed the scroll, but the damage was done. The lantern's glass fogged from inside, and when it cleared, she saw her grandmother's reflection, not as she had been, but as a bride, veiled and weeping. That night, everything fell away. The walls of the house blurred, the bed dissolved. She stood in a forest, wearing red. A procession stretched before her, hundreds of people with no faces, dressed in mourning white, carrying paper offerings and black incense, and at the front, the groom, unmoving, waiting. He held the lantern in one hand, in the other a scroll of blood. Wen tried to run. Her feet would not move. The forest turned to corridors. Corridors turned to hallways of bone. The groom stepped forward, and beneath the mask, his mouth opened. Finish the vows. She awoke screaming, and found the scroll on her chest, open to the second line, written in wet red ink. But she hadn't written it. The fog never lifted that morning. It clung to the village like wet skin, blurring the crooked houses and swallowing every sound. Even the birds stayed silent. Wen stood on the narrow stone path, clutching the cursed scroll to her chest, heart heavy with dread. Last night's dream hadn't faded with sleep. She could still feel the veil over her face, still hear the drums, still see the groom's blank, waiting mask behind her eyes. But it was the scroll on her chest, wet with ink she hadn't written, that shook her to her core. She needed answers, not from ghosts, not from dreams, from the living. Wen knocked on the door of the village herbalist, a hunched woman named Madame Zhao, whose house smelled of dried roots and vinegar. The door creaked open slowly. Zhao's eyes narrowed the moment she saw Wen. "I have nothing to sell you." "I'm not here for herbs," she said. "I'm here for the truth. No one in Junliu wants the truth. That's why we stay quiet. But I need to know about the last bride, the one who burned." Madame Zhao's eyes widened. She opened the door wider, looked over her shoulder, then ushered Wen inside without a word. The inside of the house was cramped and dim, lined with jars of preserved insects, scrolls tied with twine, and talismans strung like spiderwebs. Zhao lit a small candle and sat across from Wen at a low wooden table. She didn't speak for a long while. Finally, she said, "You're not the first to wear the veil." Wen didn't respond. "You're not even the first to fight it," Zhao added bitterly. "But the lantern doesn't forget." "Who was she?" Wen asked quietly. "Her name was Shulan. She lived here during my youth, a distant cousin to your grandmother. Quiet girl, always alone. She laughed like she knew something terrible the rest of us didn't." Madame Zhao's voice grew quieter. "On the eve of her 27th birthday, the drums started. The village knew what it meant. She tried to run. She didn't get far. She made it to the river. We heard her screams from the edge of town. By the time we found her, her body had turned to coal." Wen's blood ran cold. "She was burned alive?" "No, she burned from the inside out. Her eyes boiled, her mouth filled with smoke, her skin cracked open like a kiln. There was no fire around her, not one spark, but her bones still glowed in the dark when we buried her." Madame Zhao leaned forward. "She broke the wedding pact, or maybe she just refused to finish it. The lantern claimed her anyway." Wen swallowed hard. What happened to her family? Cursed, one by one. Their crops failed. Their youngest son drowned in a dry well. Her father gouged out his own eyes so he wouldn't see her in dreams anymore. And the lantern? Zhao pointed to Wen's chest. You already carry it. Wen returned home as the sky darkened again, the clouds as heavy as her thoughts. Her grandmother had hidden the truth. The village had buried its shame. But the past still beat like a second heart beneath the floorboards of her house. And now it was waking up. She sat before the altar and stared at the bone lantern, still glowing without flame, still whispering without words. It was neither cold nor hot. It was something else, something unnameable. She placed the scroll beside it and unwrapped the veil again. It smelled of ashes and roses, soft and brittle in her hands. She remembered Madame Zhao's words. She laughed like she knew something terrible the rest of us didn't. Wen wasn't laughing. She was beginning to understand. The dreams weren't dreams. The drums weren't echoes. The marriage was real, and it was unfinished. That night, the veil moved on its own. Wen had placed it in a locked drawer, but when she awoke at midnight, it was wrapped around her pillow. Her reflection in the mirror showed her wearing it, though her hands were empty. She screamed. Her voice died before it left her throat. From outside, the drums beat once. Boom! Then silence. Then again. Boom! She rushed to the window. Nothing but fog, but the rhythm continued as if from beneath the earth itself. She lit a candle. The flame curled sideways, sucked toward the lantern like breath into a lung. Wen sat before it, shaking. She touched the scroll. The ink shimmered. The second line was now written. From dusk to death, I vow my shadow to yours. The air in the room shifted, grew dense. The lantern pulsed. A voice whispered, not in her ears, but in her bones. It didn't speak language. It spoke memory. She saw herself as a child running through Junlu, veil trailing behind her like a red comet. She saw her mother screaming in the rain, dragging her through mud, away from the village, away from the house. She saw her grandmother kneeling before the lantern, carving a character into her own arm. Shu, redemption. And then she saw the groom, unmasked. His face was unfinished, as if death had halted halfway. His mouth moved. The voice came again. Do not break the bond or burn. Wen collapsed onto the floor, gasping. When she opened her eyes, the veil was back in the drawer. The scroll was blank again, and the bone lantern now pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She knew what came next. She could no longer run. She had to understand the ritual if she had any hope of surviving it. And to do that, she would have to open the last sealed cabinet in her grandmother's house, the one with the bone lock, the one with the iron pin, the one that her grandmother had carved into with the words, "For the bride's eyes only."
The fog had settled in her lungs. That's how Wen felt on the 5th day, like every breath was laced with something not meant to be inhaled, something centuries old and watching. The air in the house had changed, heavier, still but not silent. There was a hum beneath the silence now, a pressure, as though the walls were holding back sound that wanted to scream. She hadn't slept properly in days. When she closed her eyes, she saw things that didn't leave when she opened them. She saw the grooms standing in the corners of rooms that weren't real. She saw wedding processions moving backward through the forest. She saw her grandmother, veiled in white, cutting her own shadow loose with a blade carved from antler. And always, always, the veil, draped over her face, smelling of something between blood and incense. That morning, the mirror in the hallway cracked. She hadn't touched it. But when she passed, her reflection didn't. It stayed, smiling. Only when she doubled back to check was the glass fractured, hairline cracks like a spider's web, stretching outward from the face of a woman who looked just like her, but whose eyes were too wide and too hollow. She covered the mirror with cloth and locked the hallway door, but the reflection stayed in her mind. She opened the last cabinet after lunch. The bone lock was brittle with age. One firm pull broke it in half, leaving a dry white powder on her fingers. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was a leather-bound journal, old, bound in black thread. The front bore a single character, Jia, marriage. Her grandmother's handwriting filled the pages, but the words weren't those of a woman in control. They were the ramblings of someone drowning beneath ritual. The veil speaks. It sleeps in the drawer, but I hear it folding itself in the night. The groom's shadow passed through the floorboards last night. He leaves ash in his footprints. I passed it to Mei Ying. She burned, but I lived. I don't know if that makes me human anymore. Wen's hands trembled as she turned the final page. A single line was written there, pressed so deep the paper had torn. If I fail to feed the lantern, he will wear me instead. That night, Wen set up 3 cameras in the house, one in the hallway mirror, one on the altar, and one in her bedroom. She needed proof, not for others, for herself. She needed to know she wasn't unraveling, that something real was happening, that the veil wasn't just a curse passed through blood, but a presence, an intelligence, stalking her from the edge of ritual. She fell asleep just before midnight. She didn't dream of the groom this time. She dreamed of herself, alone in a crimson room with no doors, no windows, no light. Only the lantern glowing in the center like a heartbeat trapped in glass. She sat across from herself, but the other Wen was veiled, silent, staring. The real Wen whispered, "What do you want?" And the veiled one lifted her hand. In it, a scroll, unrolling, unraveling, bleeding. Words wrote themselves across it in red fire. "You are the offering." Then came the music, not drums, flutes, low and mournful, the kind played at funerals for the unwed dead. The sound poured into her ears like oil. She screamed, the dream cracked, and she awoke in the hallway, standing before the mirror, with the veil over her face and both of her hands clasped in prayer. She ran to the cameras. Her laptop trembled on the altar as she inserted the memory cards, fingers shaking. The hallway footage showed her passing by once. The mirror did not reflect. But at midnight, something new appeared. A shape behind the veil in the mirror, tall, rigid, wearing ceremonial robes. Its hands moved across her shoulders, but in the real world, nothing touched her. In the altar footage, the lantern's flames swirled faster and faster, forming faces, mouths that screamed, mouths that sang. In the bedroom footage was worst of all. At 2:13 a.m., her body sat up in bed. The eyes were open but fully black. She rose, walked to the corner, and began whispering in a language Wen had never heard.
But in the background, behind the camera lens, a second voice whispered back. She burned the footage by dawn, smashed the camera lenses, but the veil would not burn. She tried, poured kerosene over it in the stove, struck a match, lit it. It smoked, but it did not blacken. It twisted in the flame, folding itself, changing shape. By the time the fire died, it was untouched, and now it smelled of jasmine. She screamed into her hands, "What do you want from me?" The lantern pulsed, once, then again. The scroll on the table flipped open by itself. The third line had appeared. No brushstroke, no hand, just there, written in the ink of silence. Until the last breath leaves the body, I belong to you. Her eyes burned, her nose bled. She curled into a ball on the floor, shaking, sobbing. She didn't know how much more she could take. Every hour peeled another layer from her mind. Every night invited something else to wear her face. Every breath was a ritual now. Even blinking felt like a vow. Then, in her grief, she remembered Madame Zhou's warning. The lantern doesn't take rejection lightly, but it hates being seen. The spirits weren't omnipotent. They were ancient, but bound by rules, by rites. She could study them. She could try to outmatch them. But she'd need someone who understood living ritual magic. Not a folklorist, a practitioner. There was a man her grandmother had once mentioned, a Taoist wanderer who walked between worlds, a man with more scars than stories. If he still lived, he might be her only hope, because she could feel it now. The veil no longer needed her to wear it. It had started wearing her. The fog had seeped into her bones. When no longer marked time by sunrise or meal, she marked it by how many times the veil moved without wind, how often her reflection delayed by a heartbeat, and how many new lines appeared on the cursed scroll each morning. The house was changing with her. Its wood groaned like an aging body. Its shadows stretched when she turned away. The bone lantern pulsed in slow, deliberate rhythm, as if breathing in sync with her own lungs. But the true shift came that afternoon, when she found the box. It was buried beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom, one she'd stepped over a dozen times, but never noticed until now. Her foot caught on the edge, the plank lifted like it had been waiting. Inside, a cedar chest, sealed in wax. No key. But her fingers, without thinking, traced the same character on the lid again and again. Q.A. Regret. She dug her nails into the wax and pried the lid open. The smell was immediate. Old paper, dried blood, mold, and something sweeter, rotting jasmine. Inside, wrapped in yellowed silk, were a black and white photograph, water-stained and creased, a bundle of hair tied with red thread, and a tiny, brittle shoe shaped for a child's bound foot, and a diary. The photograph was the first dagger. Two young girls stood side by side, identical, their faces round and solemn, their braids matching, their red dresses brightened by hand-painted ink. On the back, Shuang and Mei Ying, age 8, one will live, one will serve. Wen stared at the names. She knew her grandmother's name, Shuang, but she had never heard Mei Ying, not once. The diary was thin, each page written in her grandmother's sharp, deliberate hand. They told me I was the chosen one, the next lantern bride, that the curse flows through the eldest daughter's bloodline, that I would marry a spirit older than the village itself. I believed them. I prepared. I wore the veil. I said the first vow. But I couldn't go through with it. So I chose another, my twin, my Mei Ying. Wen's hands shook. She read on. I asked her to join me at the shrine, told her it was only practice, told her we would play bride and groom. She laughed. She always trusted me. I lit the lantern with her hair. I placed the veil on her head. I spoke her name into the scroll, and he took her. The next entry was smeared, the ink warped by dried tears. She screamed, she thrashed, she begged me to take it back. But the flame had caught, and once the veil is worn, it cannot be removed. When she burned, she didn't turn to ash, she turned to silence. Her mouth stayed open, and for years I saw her in every mirror. Wen dropped the book, stumbled away. Her knees hit the floor. Her breath came in gasps. This was not just a curse. This was a betrayal. The bloodline wasn't punished. It was paid. One life for the other, one twin for the other. And now Wen understood why her grandmother had spent the rest of her life in isolation, why her mother had fled the village in terror, and why the veil had waited so long to return. Because the last contract had finally expired and the lantern was hungry again. That evening, Wen stood before the altar. The veil lay folded beside the lantern. The scroll sat open, unmoved by wind. The bone lantern pulsed slowly like a heart submerged in water. She lit no candles. There was no need. The lantern's glow was enough. She picked up the photograph, looked into the eyes of the two girls, and whispered, "I'm sorry." For the first time, the lantern responded. It flared, bright and violent, casting long shadows that danced like limbs across the walls. And behind her, the wind moaned through the cracks of the house. "She never forgave you." Wen turned, but no one stood there. Still, she felt it. A presence, a shape just beyond the veil of perception. Mei Ying. Not the girl from the photo, but the bride who burned. That night, the dreams returned. Only this time, Wen did not wear the veil. Mei Ying did. Her mouth was sewn shut with red string. Her eyes bled tears of soot. She stood in a bridal chamber made of bone, its pillars carved from skulls, the ceiling lined with red thread and finger bones. Wen tried to speak, to apologize, but Mei Ying raised her hand and the gesture silenced her breath. Then Mei Ying placed the veil into the lantern flame and smiled. Her skin cracked, and she said, without lips, "You owe him now." Wen woke to find soot on her bedsheets, a line of ash across her pillow, and on her window, written in fog, a single word: Shao, redemption. She knew what she had to do. Not run, not plead, understand. She had to find the groom's name, his tomb, his rites, because if she could find how he was buried, maybe she could undo it, maybe she could sever the contract before it reached her blood. Maybe. But the veil would not wait much longer, and the scroll was almost halfway filled. The lantern no longer glowed. It pulsed, slow, rhythmic, alive. Wen stood before it as the seventh night crept in through the windows like breath from the tomb. The air had grown colder, but not the kind of cold you could escape with blankets or fire. It was the cold of something ancient waking up, something watching from beneath the floorboards of her bloodline. She stared at the lantern, its faint heartbeat echoing in her chest. Then she saw it. A small seam at the base, hidden beneath the carved glyphs and layers of time. A compartment. Her grandmother's diary had mentioned it only once. Do not open the base unless you are ready to see the price paid by every bride before you. But Wen was past the point of fearing secrets. She needed truth, even if it burned. She took a thin blade from the kitchen and slid it gently into the groove. The seam clicked. The compartment opened, and the scent hit her like a storm. Sweet rot, burnt hair, dried copper. Inside, a hollow lined in red silk, blackened with age. Resting within it were 4 objects. A lock of coarse black hair, bound in red thread. A small glass vial filled with powdered bone ash. A set of 5 human teeth, child-sized, filed to sharp points. And at the very center, a jade ring cracked down the middle. She reached for the ring first. The moment her fingers touched it, her vision twisted. The room darkened, the floor dropped away, and for a breathless instant she stood in someone else's memory. She was in a wooden chamber lit by candlelight. A girl knelt before the altar, veiled, silent. Her hands shook as she reached into the same compartment, lifting the same jade ring. Wen could not see her face, but she could hear her thoughts. I don't want this. I don't want to belong to someone I've never seen. The girl pressed the ring to her lips and whispered, "Let this offering bind me. Let this pain be enough." Then, just as suddenly, Wen snapped back into the present, collapsed on the floor. Her fingers still clutched the ring. The veil was no longer beside the lantern. It now lay over her shoulders. She stumbled backward, shaking the veil free. Her breath came fast, shallow. The scroll on the table flipped again. Another line had appeared. With ash I submit. With blood I remain. Wen's hands trembled as she unfolded the secondary scroll hidden in the altar. It was thinner, red ink on silk. A guide, a list of offerings, instructions for how to complete the ritual without full surrender. If the bride cannot fully vow, she may delay the bond through substitution. 1 item for each line, 1 relic for each vow. The ash, the tooth, the lock, the ring. But once placed, they cannot be taken back. Each offering deepens the tether. Wen felt sick, but she understood. If she followed the steps, she might survive. Not escape, but survive. At least long enough to find the groom's tomb. She began the rite at midnight. The scroll had said, "Begin when the breath of the living is weakest, when the veil of the world is thin." She placed the 4 items on the altar in the order written. First, the ash. She poured the bone dust into the brazier. It hissed, turning the incense smoke dark. Second, the teeth. She dropped them into a bowl of blood mixed with her thumb. They dissolved like sugar. Third, the hair. She tied it around her wrist with the red thread, whispering, "Not my hair, not my breath, let another serve." Fourth, the ring. She placed it at the base of the lantern, and the moment it touched the wood, the lantern flared, not with light, with sound. A deep hum filled the room, vibrating through her chest. From the hallway, a door slammed open. Footsteps, but not walking, dragging. She turned, heart slamming in her throat. The veil rose into the air by itself. It hovered before her, twisting, opening, waiting. She backed away. "No," she whispered. "I gave you what you wanted." The lantern flickered once. Then from the shadows, a voice, dry and ancient, answered. "Ah, you gave pieces, but the soul must follow." She screamed. The windows burst outward, the mirror in the hallway shattered, and the veil flew forward, slamming into her face. She fell. Darkness took her. She awoke to silence. A cold wind rolled through the house, though no door was open. The veil lay folded neatly on the altar once more. The scroll now glowed faintly. 6 lines complete, 8 remained. She was halfway through the ritual, and every offering had not freed her. It had rooted her deeper. She couldn't stop now. If she turned back, she would burn, just like Mei Ying, just like the others. She needed to find his tomb, before the final vows were written, before her soul was no longer hers to command. By the 8th night, Wen no longer questioned the veil. It appeared without her consent, on the table, on the bed, wrapped around the mirror, folded like waiting fingers on her pillow. Each time she destroyed it, it returned, unburned, untouched. Each time, the scent changed. Ash, jasmine, blood, smoke. She stopped fighting it. There were no rules anymore, only rhythms. Ancient, unrelenting. She was not performing the ritual now. The ritual was performing itself through her. She awoke that morning already dressed in red. Not a wedding dress, not yet, but a kippao she had never owned, embroidered with frayed silver dragons and patterns of longevity knots along the collar. It fit perfectly. But the moment she saw it, she vomited. She didn't remember putting it on, didn't remember undressing the night before, but the outfit bore a faint scent of incense and old pressed flowers. The mirror, newly replaced, reflected something she couldn't accept. Her body, her face, but her eyes were different. Too calm, too ready. She tore the dress off, stuffed it into a plastic bag, and ran into the village. She needed to see people, touch something real, remind herself that the world still existed outside of the house, outside of the lantern's pull. But the village was already gone, not physically, spiritually. People saw her and turned away, windows slammed shut, doors locked. An old woman spat in her direction and whispered, "The drums walk with her now." A child cried when she passed, clawing at his mother to look away. Even the dogs, a stray pack that once barked at anything, now whined and curled their tails, crawling back into alleys when she neared. Only one person didn't flee. Madame Zhuo. She stood at her doorstep, arms folded, watching Wen approach with eyes that had seen this too many times. "You wore it," Zhuo said without accusation. "I didn't mean to." "They never do." "I need to stop it." Zhuo shook her head. "You can't stop the wedding. You're past the threshold. The procession has already begun." Wen's mouth dried. "What procession?" Zhuo pointed to the mountain path behind the shrine. "Go tonight, after dusk, and don't speak a word. Just listen. Then you'll understand." Wen waited for sunset. She took no phone, no flashlight, only herself and the red thread still tied around her wrist. She climbed the path slowly, heart pounding like a second drumbeat behind her ribs.
Halfway up the trail, the air changed. No breeze, no birds, just the faint sound of flutes. Low, sorrowful, and distant. She walked further, and then she heard it. The procession, but not with her ears, with her bones. The rhythm of paper drums, the chime of funeral bells, the rustle of cloth over dirt, and the hollow sound of feet that never touched the earth. She ducked behind a tree, her breath caught. Below her, winding through the fields, a glowing trail emerged. Lanterns, red and dim, carried by figures with no faces, dozens of them, all dressed in white mourning robes. Some held incense, others carried offerings, bowls of rice, blood-colored wine, cages of silent birds. And at the very front, a tall figure, cloaked in crimson, the groom. His mask was carved bone. His hands were wrapped in red thread that bled where it bound his skin. He held a lantern, her lantern. She stared in silent horror as the procession passed beneath the trees. None of them looked up, but she felt them see her, every one of them. The groom stopped once, tilted his head, and then continued walking toward her house. When the last lantern faded into the mist, Wen collapsed, sobbing into the earth. She wasn't preparing for the wedding anymore. The wedding was already underway. She ran back home as fast as her legs could carry her, but when she opened the door, they had already been inside. The altar had changed. The items she had offered were gone, replaced by new ones. A comb, a crimson sash, a pair of embroidered shoes. On the scroll, a new line had written itself. I walk toward you in red, so your shadow may never forget mine. She screamed and ripped the veil in half. The pieces fluttered to the floor, but when she blinked, it was whole again, and this time on her head. She ripped open every drawer in the house, searching for anything that could help, and in the kitchen, behind a cabinet, she found a talisman pressed into the wood with candle wax. Burned into it was a name, a forbidden name. Zhao Hanyu. She didn't recognize it, not from the family tree, not from the village records, but when she whispered it aloud, the house shuddered and the lantern cracked. Just once, a hairline fracture, but it was there. And from the scroll came the sound of laughter, dry, distant, triumphant. That night, she awoke standing again, this time in the courtyard. Lantern swung above her, a red veil on her face, her hands folded over her abdomen. Someone had drawn a circle around her in ash, and outside the ring, the wedding guests waited. Their faces were blank masks, their hands held ropes, and every one of them stared with empty sockets. The groom stood across from her, but now his face was almost visible, half skin, half bone. His eyes were sunken and deep, but they glowed. His hand reached forward. The scroll unfurled in the air between them. She saw the next vow, not written in ink, etched in her skin, on her wrist, burning. Your life is mine. Your blood is seal. Your body, the vessel. She collapsed to the floor in the circle. When she awoke, the ash was still there. So were the footprints around her. The veil hung over her bed like a bride waiting to be worn, and on her palm, seared into the flesh, was the next character. Hun, marriage. The procession would return tomorrow night, closer, louder, faster. There was no more time. She had to find Zhao Hanyu, the groom, the sorcerer.
the dead who refused to stay buried.
The name echoed long after she spoke it. Zhao Hanyu. 3 syllables that seemed to hang in the corners of the house like ash suspended in still air. She whispered it once, then again. The house responded. The lantern flared, the scroll bled, and the veil, folded neatly on the altar, unfurled on its own and draped itself across the floor like it was crawling toward her on invisible limbs. Wen staggered back, but the name had already opened something. Not just a memory, a door. And now he was stepping through it. She found the truth in the forbidden books hidden behind her grandmother's bed frame. Wrapped in red cloth, inked in talismanic seals, soaked in oils long since dried. She cut through the twine with shaking fingers and opened the first scroll. It wasn't a story. It was a trial transcript. Handwritten, stamped in the old imperial style, dated nearly 180 years ago. The charges were clear. Zhao Hanyu, Taoist ritualist, accused of spirit tethering, ghost marriage coercion, and bloodline corruption through bone flame sorcery. There were witness testimonies. All spoke of women gone missing, families cursed, whole crops failing after red lanterns were seen swaying over graves. The worst story came from a midwife. He paid me in silver to bring him the stillborn. Said he needed silence in the breath. Said he would make it live again through union. When gagged, dropping the scroll, she opened another, a funeral diagram, not of his death, of his burial. They hadn't burned him, they hadn't beheaded him. They'd married him to a spirit bride made of hair, paper, and ash, then buried him alive inside her coffin. Her blood turned to ice. They thought it would trap him, but they'd created a ritual vessel, and now that vessel had found her. The altar glowed brighter. Wen turned, and for the first time, he stood in the room. No longer in the veil of dreams, no longer behind lantern glass. Here, now. Zhao Hanyu, not fully man, not fully ghost. His skin was faded, stretched thin over a frame that didn't match time. Taoist seals covered his chest, arms, and neck, some intact, others cracked. His lips were sewn shut with red thread, but beneath the stitches, his jaw moved. He stared at her, not with rage, not with love, but with claim. Wen tried to scream. No sound came. She stumbled back. The scroll lifted off the altar and unrolled mid-air. Another vow appeared before her eyes. The groom steps forward when the bride accepts his name. Your voice has opened the gate. He walks now. Wen turned to run, but her feet locked. Her arms trembled, and suddenly she was kneeling. The veil slid over her head on its own. The candles blew out. Only the lantern remained, flickering like a dying heartbeat. Zhao took a step forward, then another, until he stood over her. He reached down and pressed his fingers to her forehead, and Wen felt it, a surge, cold, deep, alive. He wasn't just walking the house, he was moving into her. She collapsed, And when her eyes opened, the world looked different. Colors inverted at the edges. Her skin felt too tight. Her limbs responded a fraction too late. And in the mirror across the room, she watched herself stand, even though she hadn't moved. Her reflection lifted a hand. She didn't. Her reflection tilted her head and whispered, "We are bound." The next day, the villagers didn't just avoid her, they ran. One man crossed himself and dropped his groceries. A young woman screamed and cried, "She's wearing his shadow." Wen couldn't argue. She could feel him now. Beneath her thoughts, a second presence, breathing, hungry, waiting. She confronted the monk at the village shrine. He didn't deny it. "You spoke his name. That was the last seal. Why is he waking now?" "Because your grandmother delayed the union, but time cannot be cheated forever. The lantern was never just a vessel. It's an invitation, a promise. It waited for you, and now he is inside it." "No," Wen whispered, eyes wide. "He's inside me." The monk looked away. "You must finish the rites." "And if I don't?" He met her eyes. "You'll still be his, but you'll be hollow. He'll wear your skin like a robe." That night, Wen tried to draw a banishment circle around the altar. Salt, talisman ink, blood from her finger. But the moment she completed it, the walls cracked, the lantern shook, the scroll burst into flame, but only for a moment, then reassembled in her hand. And now the next line was burned into it. "Do not deny me, wife of the red veil. You are already within the bridal chamber." Her hands went cold, and then her fingers moved. Not all of them, just her right hand. It lifted, slow, trembling, and reached for the lantern without her will. She grabbed it with the other hand and forced it down. But the body was splitting. She could feel herself being ridden, like a horse trained for an eternal ceremony. She locked herself in the basement, scribbled talismans over her skin, drank salt water, bit her own tongue to stay conscious, but the veil whispered. The scroll glowed, and now in her sleep, she dreamed of him again. Only this time, his lips were no longer sewn. They moved, and he spoke. "I lived once, but they buried me without breath. Now you are my lungs." Wen woke screaming. The mirror cracked. Blood trickled from her nose. On the floor beside her, a footprint. Not hers. And on her ankle, a ring of red thread, knotted 5 times. The marriage had already begun, and Zhao Hanyu was no longer waiting behind the veil. He was walking through it. Wen had begun to count the silences. They were longer now, thicker, stretched like skin over bone, moments where her thoughts stopped mid-sentence, moments when she blinked and forgot where she was, moments when her own voice, quiet, internal, human, was drowned beneath something deeper, something male, something ancient. Zhao Hanyu was no longer simply visiting. He was moving in, and Wen's body was beginning to forget who it belonged to. Wen woke with soil beneath her fingernails, dirt under her tongue, mud in her hair, but she hadn't left the bed. The sheets were perfectly smooth, the windows locked. Only the lantern flickered wildly, as if laughing. She checked her feet, bare, scraped, bleeding at the toes. She had walked somewhere, in her sleep or in his. At the shrine, she begged the monk again. There has to be a way to cast him out. There was, he said, before the veil chose you, before you spoke his name, before the scroll burned its vows into your skin. I didn't ask for this. None of them did. Then help me, he sighed. You can't destroy the lantern. It's not the source, it's the symptom. He doesn't live inside the flame. He lives inside the bond. He's growing in the space where your resistance used to be. What happens when he finishes? The monk didn't answer, but Wen already knew. She would vanish, and only his smile would remain. She returned home with shaking hands and a desperate heart, taped knives to her wrists, lit every candle she could find, burned sage, recited prayers in Mandarin and English, and even the broken Hokkien her grandmother once muttered when drunk. But it didn't matter. The moment she passed the altar, her legs buckled, her arms moved upward without consent, her mouth opened, and from within her throat came a voice not her own. Hush, wife. She fell to the ground screaming. Her hands clawed at her own face, not out of fear, out of interruption. Her fingers weren't trying to hurt her, they were trying to silence her. She bit her tongue, tasted blood. Only then did the voice retreat. Only then did she remember her name. That night, she did not sleep. She watched herself, sat across from a mirror, unblinking, veil draped in her lap. And for 38 minutes, her reflection didn't move, until it smiled and said in Zhao Hanyu's voice, "You wear me well." She smashed the mirror, broke the altar, pulled the lantern from its base and hurled it to the ground. It cracked, the flame sputtered, but it did not die. The fracture spread like veins across the bone frame. A hiss escaped the glass, and something black and smoky poured out. A figure, shifting, half-formed. Its arms were too long, its spine too curved, its face a swirl of ink. But it stepped toward her, not fast, slow, sure, like a groom walking down the aisle. She grabbed the nearest knife, slashed at the figure. The blade went through, and still it smiled, not with lips, with presence. She screamed and ran from the room. The lantern, though broken, glowed brighter. She locked herself in the kitchen, drew talismans in her blood on the walls, recited every incantation she'd memorized from the old scrolls, but she could still hear him, in the pipes, in the floor, in her teeth. The wedding night is near. The scroll unrolled itself beside her. 3 new lines had appeared, not written, branded, burned into the paper. Her hands shall fold in offering. Her lips shall carry my breath. Her heart shall beat beside mine. And beneath that, a single character had been carved into the wood of the table. To merge. She blacked out shortly after, and when she awoke, she was in the forest, veil on her face, blood on her feet, and the groom behind her, whispering ancient rites in her ears. She didn't fight. She couldn't. She watched it happen, watched her own hands trace Taoist sigils into the air, watched her own mouth repeat the lines of the vow word for word, until she snapped awake back in her bed, sweating, crying, and smelling of funeral incense. The scroll lay beside her, the next line already written.
You are ready. She looked in the mirror once more, and now it didn't show her at all. Just Zhao, just his smile, wearing her teeth.
She walked for hours, barefoot, veiled, thread-wrapped. The blood on her feet had dried into cracked patterns by the time she reached the next village. The sun had not risen, but she followed the smell of burned herbs and the sound of crows. Omens, her grandmother once said, of a Taoist who had seen beyond death. And there, outside an old stilt house surrounded by faded red charms, she found him, the exorcist, a wanderer wrapped in gray robes, his back to her, brushing salt across a threshold with a horsehair whisk. He didn't turn, but he spoke. "The lantern bride comes walking." His voice was calm, old, carved from wind. Wen fell to her knees. "I need help!" "I know. I need him out of me." The exorcist finally turned. One of his eyes was sewn shut. The other was white, but glowed faintly. He studied her in silence, then pointed toward the fire pit. "Sit, and do not speak unless I ask." She obeyed. He circled her 3 times, muttering in tongues she didn't understand. The crows screamed overhead. He placed a bowl of black ink in front of her, mixed with crushed ash and ground bone. From his robe he pulled a brush made of human hair. "Hold out your hands," he said. She did. He painted glyphs onto her palms, Taoist circles, broken chains, seals meant to unbind spirit from body. Then he dipped his thumb into the ink and pressed it to her forehead. The world swayed. He began to chant, low and slow. The brush moved again, this time across her chest, drawing a seal of protection. But before he could finish, the ink on her skin melted, turned to smoke, and from within her mouth came his voice. "You are too late, priest." The exorcist froze. His hand trembled, then he stumbled back. "No," he whispered. "No, she's already half dead." Wen blinked. The voice receded. She gasped. "What does that mean?" "You've passed the 3rd threshold," he said, stepping away. "You've said the name. You've accepted the veil. You've made offerings. He's nested in you now, feeding." "Can you cast him out?" He looked down, then said softly, "Not without killing you." Silence fell like ash. Wen's hands shook. "So what now? I just wait to be worn like a dress?" The exorcist looked at her, not with cruelty, but sorrow. "There is only one way left." "What?" "Complete the wedding. "Finish it?"
And then, when the last vow is spoken, when the union is sealed in flesh, you must sever it yourself."
"With what?"
He reached into his satchel, pulled out a blade, black, thin, carved from bone. "This is a ghost's tooth, pulled from the skull of a ghost bride who never found rest. It can cut between worlds, but only once. Use it wisely." Wen stared at the blade, cold, hungry, and hers. He gave her one last thing, a slip of silk inked in silver, a character she had never seen, not in any scroll, not in any temple, a glyph older than language.
"What does it mean?"
she asked. "It means unbecoming," the exorcist whispered. "You may not survive the cut, but if you do, the bond will be undone." He bowed once, then turned away. Wen opened her mouth to thank him, but her voice spoke without her. "The bride does not need permission." She ran from the village, clutching the blade, the veil, the last talisman. She could feel Zhao Hanyu now completely, his fingers in her spine, his breath in her lungs. When she walked, he guided. When she blinked, he lingered. When she cried, he smiled. She no longer dreamed, she only remembered. Memories not her own. His lovers, his rituals, his punishments. The faces of brides he'd buried alive to bind their ghosts into obedience. And worst of all, his joy. He loved her. Not like a man, like a collector loves a final piece. When she reached the house, the altar had changed again. A bridal bed had appeared in the corner, draped in red silk. A paper effigy of her stood at its center, faceless, veiled, and the scroll now hovered in mid-air. 11 lines written, 3 remained. At the foot of the bed, the bone lantern pulsed, but it was no longer cracked. It was whole again, mended, healed, with her blood. Wen stared at the blade. The glyph of unbecoming pulsed against her palm. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. Not until she read the final vows. Not until she stood in the circle one last time and saw him as he truly was. Only then could she choose to kill or be claimed.
It began just after sunset. The wind stopped, the insects hushed, and the veil unfolded itself at the foot of her bed. Not with violence, not with urgency, but with finality. Like a curtain rising for the last act of a play written in blood. The scroll hovered in mid-air, ink shimmering in the lantern's flickering light. 12 vows completed, 2 remained. The air inside the house turned thick, perfumed with jasmine and smoke. She stood slowly, no resistance left, only ritual. She dressed in the red wedding robes laid across her bed, embroidered silk, gilded thread, patterns of lotus and phoenix. She hadn't placed them there, but they fit her perfectly. The house had changed. It was no longer her grandmother's. It was no longer a house. It was a bridal chamber. The walls had grown tall, shadowy, draped in veils. Red lanterns floated in the air, each one flickering with soul flame. The altar now resembled a ceremonial dais, layered with ancestral offerings, rows of candles and bowls of black wine. The bone lantern floated above it all, spinning slowly, casting moving shadows across the walls like dancing guests. Wen stepped forward, not entirely by choice, but not unwilling. The veil hovered before her, then draped itself gently over her head. The world dimmed, colors dulled, but shapes grew sharper. She could see the aisle now, made of ash, 2 rows of faceless guests on either side, effigies in mourning robes, paper faces, no eyes, just mouths, open, smiling. A drum beat once, the floor shook. Twice, the lantern flared. A 3rd time, and the procession began. Wen stepped forward. Each footstep left behind a smear of blood and salt. The guests bowed as she passed. The scroll followed her, suspended above her head, turning its pages with a phantom wind. The final vows had appeared. I bind breath to breath, flesh to flesh, name to name. We are one beyond the veil, husband and vessel, bride and tomb. Her knees weakened, but she did not fall. She was halfway through the aisle when she saw him, Zhao Hanyu, waiting at the altar, no longer blurred, no longer shadow. He wore robes of red and bone. His face was half mask, half skin, stitched along the cheek with threads that pulsed like veins.
His eyes were black pits burning with ancient fire. He extended a hand. It trembled, not with nerves, with hunger. Wen reached the altar and stood across from him. The veil between them was lifted by hands she could not see. A voice boomed from nowhere and everywhere. "Do you accept this bond?" Wen tried to speak. Her mouth did not move. Her body nodded. The scroll caught fire, but did not burn. It glowed, then disintegrated into 1,000 glowing moths that spun in the air before vanishing into her chest. She gasped. Something entered. Not a wind, not a soul. A joining, a fusion. The guests bowed. The lantern rang like a bell, and Zhao Hanyu stepped forward. One hand lifted her chin, the other held the jade ring, now whole. He placed it on her finger. It burned cold, and the world collapsed. She was nowhere. She was inside a tomb, inside a memory, inside him. She saw his life, his work as a Taoist scribe, the forbidden books, the rituals, the deaths. She saw his trial, his laughter, his final vow. "If I cannot live as man, I will live as God. My bride will be the future. My heart will burn across bloodlines." She saw his burial, the red coffin, the spirit bride inside burning. She screamed and returned. She was back in the house, the altar gone, the guests gone, but the veil remained. So did the ring, and the lantern. It now floated in front of her, whole, alive, and inside it, her reflection, wearing Zhao's smile. A voice whispered from within her throat, "The vows are sealed. The bride is mine." And in the mirror across the room, she no longer saw herself, just him, fully, entirely, smiling. She fell to the floor sobbing, but even her sobs felt distant, like echoes from behind glass. Her body was half hers, her breath shared, and the final line of the scroll, though never spoken aloud, was already written in her bones. "Let none unbind what death has wed." She didn't sleep. There was no longer a need. Sleep was for the living, and Wen was now something else. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the house that was no longer a house. The red silk still draped the walls. The lantern no longer flickered. It hovered, still, glowing, waiting. The veil rested on her shoulders like a second skin. Her hands were cold, but her pulse was warm, and she was no longer sure whose it was. The groom didn't speak with words, but she understood him now. Their thoughts drifted together in a current deeper than language. He had finished the ritual. He had bound himself to her soul. And now came the final seal, the merging. "Say yes," the voice echoed inside her, "and you will never be alone again. No death, no aging, no silence." Wen shook. Fingers clutched the hem of her robe. "What happens to me?" "You become part of me, the vessel, the memory, the echo." She tasted bile, tasted smoke, and still, part of her wanted it, the stillness, the end of pain. No more fear, no more doubt, just warmth, eternal. But then, she saw the mirror flicker. A new image, a child, stepping out of a taxi, suitcase in hand, looking around, confused, wearing a pink hoodie,
hair tied with red thread. Mei Lin, her cousin's daughter, only 15, come to pay respects, perhaps, to find her family roots, unaware, unchosen, but of the same blood, and now visible to the lantern. The flame twisted, the air shifted, and she knew the groom was offering her an out. You may choose union or substitution. A cruel mercy, a loophole written into every curse. The bloodline must continue, but the bride could be swapped if willing, or even unaware. Wen stood on shaking legs, walked to the window. Outside, the fog curled like breath, and Mei Lin was walking up the path, smiling, a stranger to the weight of the air. Wen turned to the altar. The scroll was gone. In its place, 2 veils, one red, one white, and the bone lantern between them, glowing faintly, pulsing, waiting. She stepped toward the red veil, lifted it. Her fingers trembled. So light, so final. Choose her, the voice whispered inside her, and I will walk through her instead. You will wake, you will live, no one will know. Choose yourself, and you will vanish into me. Wen closed her eyes, felt the floor under her feet, felt the ring on her finger, felt the way her skin no longer felt like skin. She was fading, falling inward. Mei Lin would never know. She would sleep and never wake as herself again. The ritual would reset, and Wen would go free. She reached forward, took the white veil instead, held it in her hands. Then, with all the strength left in her, she tore it in half. The flame in the lantern flared, the windows shattered, the house shook. The groom screamed, not aloud, but inside her bones. You were chosen. Wen gritted her teeth. I choose myself. Then you are mine. She took the bone blade from her sleeve, the one the exorcist gave her, held it to her wrist, not to bleed, to carve. She whispered the glyph he taught her, unbecoming, and cut it into her own skin. The pain was immediate, blinding. Her body convulsed. The flame turned black. The groom's voice shattered into static. The veil flew into the air and caught fire. The lantern cracked again and again and again, until it shattered. Silence. Then wind. Then nothing. Wen collapsed, breathing, alone, alive. She looked at her hand. The ring was gone, the blade broken, the veil turned to ash. And outside the window, Mei Lin stood in the morning light, safe, unmarked, whole. Wen smiled. Tears rolled down her cheeks. For the first time in days, they were hers. And from the floor beside her, the final piece of the scroll fluttered gently in the breeze. One line remained. The bride who chooses herself breaks the chain. The dawn came slow. Gray light filtered through the cracked walls of the house, illuminating the remnants of the night that had nearly swallowed her whole.
Wen lay on the floor for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Her hands were still trembling. Her wrist throbbed where she had carved the glyph. Her lungs still felt full of ash, but the veil was gone. The lantern shattered, and the silence was clean, not haunted, not holding its breath, just silence, real, alive. She rose slowly. The wedding robes hung loosely now, lifeless fabric with no presence, no weight. The scroll was gone. No pages remained, no ink, no blood, no fire. The altar had split in two. The red candles melted into puddles across the floor. The paper guests had crumbled to dust. Only a thin trail of ash remained, tracing the path she had walked the night before. The Isle of the Dead, now just soot. She stepped outside. The fog had lifted. The sky was pale and cold but clear. The crows were gone, the flutes silent, the trees unmoving. And at the gate of the village, Mei Lin stood, suitcase in hand, squinting in confusion. "Jie?" she called out. "What happened here?" Wen walked toward her, barefoot, bleeding, but smiling. "You shouldn't have come." Mei Lin frowned. "I was worried. No one picked up the phone. The neighbor said you were acting strange." "I'm okay," Wen whispered. And she meant it. For the first time in what felt like centuries, she meant it. The villagers came out one by one, faces weary, watchful, but not afraid. Some bowed, some wept. Madame Zhao placed a single red chrysanthemum at the gate of Wen's house and whispered, "The lantern goes dark, but the bride still walks." Wen nodded, said nothing, just watched as the village, after so many years, exhaled. That evening she packed what little she had, tied her wrist with white thread, clean, unbound. As she locked the house for the last time, she paused at the altar, or what was left of it. There, in the corner of the cracked floor, a flicker, a single ember, orange, soft, almost breathing. She knelt, stared. The ember pulsed once, then died. Or so she told herself. She buried the blade in the mountains, burned the robes, scattered the scroll ash into the river. But the dreams, they still came. Not every night, just some. And in them, a faint humming, a flicker in a lantern far, far away. A whisper, "Another bride will come." Wen left Junliu behind, but sometimes, when the wind blows the right way, and a red lantern sways at the edge of a shrine, and a reflection lingers too long in the mirror, she feels him, waiting, not angry, just patient. Because lanterns never truly go out. They simply wait for someone to look into the flame.